The Queen Mother lived to 101. Think about what that means. Every staff member who served her in the 1930s was dead. Every courtier who witnessed her early behavior was dead. Every journalist who covered the pre-war court was dead. By the time she died on March 30th, 2002, she was the only surviving witness to her own history. And the version she told, the reluctant queen, the wartime hero, the devoted grandmother, was the only version left. This isn't a conspiracy theory. Conspiracies require planning, coordination, secrecy. What happened here required none of that. It required only time. The Queen Mother didn't need to suppress evidence because the evidence suppressed itself. She didn't need to silence critics because biology silenced them for her. And the result? This is the part that should unsettle you. Was functionally identical to the most sophisticated cover-up ever designed. By the time anyone thought to seriously interrogate her story, there was nobody left alive who had the first-hand knowledge to challenge it. Nobody. Her longevity worked like a kind of gravity. The longer she lived, the more completely her version of events became the only version, until the two were impossible to tell apart. So let's talk about who died, and when, because the names and dates are the argument. Edward VIII, the Duke of Windsor, the man who abdicated the throne. He died on May 28, 1972, 30 years before the Queen Mother. Let that land. 30 years. Edward was the one person on Earth who knew what actually happened behind closed doors during the abdication crisis of 1936. He knew what conversations took place in those rooms at Fort Belvedere. He knew what pressures were applied by the government, by the church, by his own family. He knew what role his sister-in-law really played in engineering an outcome she'd later claim to have never wanted. He published a memoir, A King's Story, in 1951, but it was cautious, diplomatic, the writing of a man still trying to maintain some thread of connection to the family that expelled him. A man still hoping, even after 15 years in exile, that some reconciliation might be possible. You don't burn bridges in a memoir if you think you might need to walk back across them. So he held back. And then he ran out of time. What Edward might have said in the age of tell-all interviews and confessional memoirs, in the 1980s or 1990s, say, when the appetite for royal revelations was insatiable, we'll never know. He died at 77 in Paris. The Queen Mother had another 3 decades ahead of her. Wallis Simpson, dead April 24, 1986. 16 years before the Queen Mother. But here's the thing about Wallis. Her testimony was lost long before her heart stopped. She spent her final years locked in severe dementia, shut away in that house on the Bois de Boulogne in Paris, her affairs controlled by a French lawyer named Maître Suzanne Blum, who guarded access to her like a vault. Blum was ferocious. She turned away journalists, biographers, even old friends of the Duchess. Whatever Wallis might have said in moments of lucidity, if there were any, Blum ensured no one was there to hear it. The woman who'd once been the most talked-about figure in the British Empire couldn't remember who she was, let alone what she knew. She'd published her own memoir, The Heart Has Its Reasons, back in 1956, and like Edward's book, it said almost nothing worth saying. Polished, guarded, written with one eye on posterity and the other on diplomacy. Whatever unvarnished truths Wallis Simpson held about Elizabeth Bowes Lyon, and given the depth and bitterness of their mutual hatred, those truths were almost certainly explosive. They dissolved in the fog of her dementia years before her body gave out. She was buried beside Edward at Frogmore on April 29, 1986. The Queen Mother didn't attend the funeral. She had 16 more years of life ahead of her. Now widen the circle. Because Edward and Wallis weren't the only ones who knew. Stanley Baldwin, the prime minister who managed the abdication crisis, the man who sat across from Edward and told him, in essence, that the country would not accept Mrs. Simpson as queen. Baldwin understood the political mechanics of the abdication better than anyone in government. He knew what deals were struck, what promises were made, what role the Yorks played behind the scenes. He knew whether Elizabeth Bowes Lyon was truly blindsided by events or whether she'd been quietly positioning her family for months. Dead December 14th, 1947. 55 years before the Queen Mother. Cosmo Gordon Lang, Archbishop of Canterbury, who wielded enormous influence during the crisis and made that infamous radio broadcast condemning Edward's craving for private happiness, a broadcast so vicious that even people who opposed Edward found it distasteful. Lang knew the religious and moral arguments that were deployed to force the abdication. He knew who was deploying them, and he knew who benefited. Dead December 5th, 1945. Walter Monckton, Edward's closest legal advisor during the abdication, the man who shuttled between Fort Belvedere and Downing Street, carrying messages back and forth in those frantic final days. Monckton understood the abdication negotiations from the inside better than almost anyone alive. He knew what Edward was promised about his future title, his finances, his wife's status, and he knew which of those promises were later broken and by whom. Dead, January 9th, 1965. Lord Beaverbrook, the press baron who brokered the extraordinary gentleman's agreement that kept the entire Simpson affair out of British newspapers until December 1936. Think about that for a moment. The king's relationship with a twice-divorced American woman was common knowledge in the United States, in Europe, in the Dominions, but the British public knew nothing, because Beaverbrook had convinced Fleet Street to maintain a wall of silence. He understood the machinery of royal narrative control better than any journalist alive. He'd seen how stories about the monarchy were made, managed, and killed. Dead, June 9th, 1964. Every one of these men, gone before the Queen Mother turned 70. And inside the household itself, the attrition was just as total. Sir Alec Harding served as private secretary to both Edward VIII and George VI. He wrote the letter that warned Edward the press silence couldn't hold, a letter that effectively forced the crisis into the open. He was there for all of it. The arguments, the tears, the constitutional maneuvering. He witnessed the abdication from a vantage point no one else occupied. Dead, May 18th, 1960. His wife Helen, who served as a lady-in-waiting to the Queen and published a careful memoir called Loyal to Three Kings in 1967, even that cautious book hinted at tensions and complexities the official narrative glossed over. Dead by 1969. Sir Alan Lascelles, known as Tommy, served as private secretary across 3 reigns. His diaries contained observations of stunning candor about the royal family, unguarded, sharp, at times scathing. He didn't just record events, he recorded character. He recorded what people were really like when they thought no one was taking notes. Dead August 10th, 1981. Those diaries weren't published in their unexpurgated form during his lifetime. The full, uncut version of what Tommy Lascelles actually thought about the monarchy wouldn't reach the public for decades after he was gone. And by then, of course, it couldn't provoke a response from anyone he'd written about. Sir Arthur Penn, treasurer to Queen Elizabeth, dead 1960. Sir Martin Gilliatt, who served as the Queen Mother's own private secretary from 1956, who knew her daily habits, her private opinions, her behind-the-scenes maneuvering more intimately than perhaps anyone outside her family, Dead, May 1993, 9 years before her. Gilead was with her for 37 years. He managed her correspondence. He arranged her schedule. He knew who she saw, who she refused to see, what she said about people when they left the room. He was the keeper of 1,000 secrets, large and small, the kind of accumulated knowledge that no archive can replicate. He never published a memoir, never sat for an oral history. Whatever he knew, he took it with him. The diarists didn't fare better. Chips Channon, the American-born conservative MP whose journals recorded 1930s Britain with lacerating honesty, dead October 7, 1958. His diaries were published in 1967, but in a heavily censored version, the most revealing royal material sliced out by his son Paul. The unexpurgated edition, edited by Simon Heffer, didn't appear until 2021 and 2022, nearly 20 years after the Queen Mother's death. By then, whatever corrections those diaries might have provoked could only land on a historical figure, not a living one. Harold Nicholson, diplomat diarist, dead May 1, 1968. Cecil Beaton, whose private journals were far more barbed than his elegant public persona, dead January 18, 1980. James Pope Hennessy, who'd been granted extraordinary access to write Queen Mary's authorized biography, and whose research notebooks contained unfiltered conversations with royal household members, murdered during a robbery at his London flat on January 25, 1974. His notes vanished into archives most researchers couldn't touch for decades. Can you feel it? Name after name, date after date, each one a door closing, each one another piece of the counter-narrative disappearing. And then there was Crawfie. Marion Crawford, the royal governess, is the single most instructive case in what happened to people who dared speak while the Queen Mother was still breathing. Crawford served the royal family from 1932, looking after Princesses Elizabeth and Margaret for nearly 2 decades. She knew those girls. She watched them grow up. In 1950, she published The Little Princesses, a gentle, affectionate memoir that revealed absolutely nothing scandalous. It was warm. It was complimentary. It painted the family in a flattering light. Didn't matter. It committed the one unforgivable sin. It revealed anything at all. The royal family cut her off. Completely. The Queen Mother never spoke to her again. Not once. Not a letter, not a phone call, not a word, for the remaining 38 years of Crawford's life. She died on February 11, 1988, in Aberdeen, in obscurity, a woman erased from the story of a family she'd helped raise. The lesson of Crawfie was understood by every single member of the royal household for the rest of the century. Speak, and you're finished. The Queen Mother didn't need to issue threats. Crawford's fate was the threat. Self-perpetuating, self-enforcing. A warning that echoed for 50 years. And it worked. Not a single member of the Queen Mother's domestic staff published a substantial tell-all memoir during her lifetime. Not one. But Crawfie's punishment wasn't even the most chilling example of how the Bowes-Lyon family handled inconvenient truths. That distinction belongs to Nerissa and Catherine. Nerissa Bowes-Lyon, born 1919. Catherine Bowes-Lyon, born 1926. They were the Queen Mother's nieces, the daughters of her brother, John Herbert Bowes-Lyon. Both girls were born with severe learning disabilities, and in 1941, both were committed to the Royal Earlswood Hospital in Red Hill, Surrey, a mental institution. They were young women. Nerissa was 22, Catherine 15, and from that moment, as far as the family was concerned, they ceased to exist. That's not a metaphor. In 1963, Burke's Peerage, the definitive record of the British aristocracy, listed both Nerissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon as dead. They weren't dead. Nerissa was 44 and Catherine was 37, both very much alive inside Earlswood. Someone had provided false information to Berks, and neither the family nor the palace corrected it. 2 living women, erased from the public record, written off as dead because their existence didn't fit the story. Nerissa died in 1986, the same year as Wallis Simpson, as it happens. She was buried at the Red Hill Cemetery in a grave marked with a plastic tag and a serial number. No headstone, no name. The grave of a woman whose aunt was the most beloved figure in Britain and whose cousin sat on the throne. When the press finally broke the story in 1987, Buckingham Palace said the Queen Mother was distressed to learn the details. Maybe she was. But the institutional reflex, the impulse to edit reality, to remove the parts that don't fit, to declare living people dead because their existence is embarrassing, that wasn't an accident. That was a pattern. Catherine, remarkably, outlived them all. She died in 2014, at the age of 87. She spent over 70 years in institutional care. No one from the family publicly acknowledged her during the Queen Mother's lifetime. Coffey told a kind story and was cut off forever. Nerissa and Catherine simply existed wrong, and they were erased entirely. That's the spectrum of control we're talking about, and the woman at its center lived to 101. By the early 1990s, the Queen Mother was in her 90s, and the field was essentially clear. The last generation that witnessed her transformation from Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, daughter of the Earl of Strathmore, into the Queen Mother of national mythology, gone. The abdication witnesses, gone. The pre-war courtiers, the post-war establishment figures, the journalists, the diarists, gone, gone, gone. She was the last one standing. But here's where it shifts from passive to active, because the deaths alone would have been enough to protect the narrative. The Queen Mother's legacy was shielded by something else, too: the deliberate, physical destruction of the documentary record. Picture Royal Lodge, Windsor, the 1990s. Princess Margaret, the Queen Mother's younger daughter, loyal, fierce, protective, standing before a fire and feeding it. Sack after sack after sack of paper. Letters, personal correspondence spanning decades. Approximately 30 sacks in total. That's not someone tidying a desk drawer. That is not a woman clearing clutter. That is the systematic erasure of decades of private communication, carried out while the Queen Mother was still alive, still lucid, still in residence. Among the letters destroyed were personal correspondence from Diana, Princess of Wales, to the Queen Mother. Think about what those might have contained. Diana in the late 1980s, early 1990s, writing to the most senior woman in the royal family about her crumbling marriage, about Charles, about the institution that was consuming her. Letters that, had they survived, might have blown open the real dynamics of the royal family during its most turbulent decade. Gone. Turned to ash in a fireplace at Royal Lodge. Margaret's stated reason was that she was trying to protect her mother and the family from future exposure. And the timing wasn't accidental. This happened during the 1990s, the decade of the Wales divorce, Andrew Morton's explosive Diana biography, the Squidgygate and Camillagate tapes, the general collapse of deference that had shielded the monarchy for generations. The royal family was hemorrhaging credibility. The press had turned hostile, and somewhere at Royal Lodge, Margaret was feeding decades of letters into a fire. Those 30 sacks weren't housekeeping. They were a preemptive strike against the very possibility of future revelation. Whatever was in them, whatever truths, whatever contradictions, whatever evidence of a Queen Mother who didn't match the mythology, no one will ever know. The protection was thorough. Beyond the burned letters, the royal archives at Windsor Castle form another wall, controlled by the sovereign, Access granted at discretion. Researchers who want to consult material relating to the Queen Mother must apply for permission, and that permission can be refused without explanation. No reason given. No appeal possible. What's in there? What was curated before deposit? What was removed before archivists ever saw it? These are questions nobody outside the Round Tower can answer. And then there's the largest category of lost information. What was never recorded in the first place? No systematic oral history project was ever conducted with the Queen Mother's household staff. Nobody sat down with her dressers, her pages, her footmen, her cooks, her chauffeurs, the people who saw her every single day, in every mood, across every decade, and said, "Tell us what you saw." These weren't famous people. They weren't going to write memoirs on their own initiative, especially after Crawfey. They needed to be asked. They needed someone with institutional authority to say, "Your memories matter. Your observations are valuable. Please let us record them." Nobody ever did. And when those people died, quietly in retirement homes and council flats across Britain, their observations died with them. Not because anyone ordered their silence, necessarily, but because nobody thought to ask. Or because those who might have asked understood that asking was itself a kind of transgression. William Tallon, Backstairs Billy, the Queen Mother's devoted page who served her for 51 years, was one of the rare staff members who actually survived her. He died in 2007. He was known to possess extraordinary knowledge of her private life, her real opinions, her genuine personality, the woman behind the wave and the hat. He gave scattered interviews after her death, and some hinted at a more complicated figure than the mythology allowed. But Tallon never wrote a comprehensive memoir. The ghost of Crawfey still haunted the servants' quarters, 50 years on. So what was all this protecting? What version of the Queen Mother might have existed if the witnesses had lived, and the letters hadn't burned, and the archives were open? Because the mythology they were shielding has a very specific shape, and the counter-evidence, fragmentary as it is, suggests a very different woman. Take the first pillar, the reluctant queen. The standard account says Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon was a charming young aristocrat who married the Duke of York in 1923 after he proposed multiple times, because she genuinely didn't want to sacrifice her freedom for royal life. When Edward abdicated in December 1936, the crown was supposedly thrust upon her husband against both their wishes. She never wanted it. She never asked for it. The counter-evidence sketches something altogether different. Elizabeth came from a family that was ambitious and socially sharp. Her mother, Cecilia, Countess of Strathmore, was deeply conscious of status and opportunity. The Bowes-Lyon family, for all their aristocratic ease, understood exactly where they sat in the social hierarchy, and exactly how far a strategic marriage could elevate them. Elizabeth herself was, by all contemporary accounts, an extraordinarily skilled social operator. Charming, yes, but also strategic, calculating, and acutely aware of the dynamics of power. Some historians have interpreted those famous repeated rejections of Prince Albert's proposals not as reluctance at all, but as positioning. A woman who understood that appearing reluctant increased her value, that a prince who had to fight for his bride would prize her more. Is that true? We can't know. The people who could have confirmed or denied it are dead. And look at what she did after the abdication. She didn't behave like someone crushed by unwanted responsibility. She adapted with remarkable speed and political sophistication, and she did it with extraordinary self-awareness about the tools of image-making. In 1938, just 2 years into the new reign, she and George VI made a state visit to Paris. She was still in mourning for her mother, Lady Strathmore, which by convention required her to wear black. So she commissioned the couturier Norman Hartnell to design an entirely white wardrobe instead. White for mourning. It was a stroke of genius. The French press went wild. They called her the most beautiful queen to visit France since Mary, Queen of Scots. Hartnell's white wardrobe turned a diplomatic obligation into a personal triumph, and it revealed something crucial. This was a woman who understood that image wasn't a byproduct of power. It was power. She wasn't just adapting to her new role. She was performing it, deliberately, strategically, with the instinct of someone who'd been preparing for this kind of stage her whole life. That performance reached its apex, of course, during the war. September 13, 1940. Buckingham Palace took a direct hit from German bombs. The Queen and the King were in residence, and her response, delivered with perfect pitch to the press, became the single most effective line of royal propaganda in the 20th century. "I'm glad we've been bombed. It makes me feel I can look the East End in the face." One sentence. Calculated, brilliant, and devastating in its simplicity. It fused the monarchy to the suffering of ordinary Londoners in a way that no amount of conventional PR could have achieved. And it was her line, not a speechwriter's, not a press secretary's. Hers. The woman who never wanted to be queen turned out to have an absolutely killer instinct for branding. But that's exactly the point. The mythology says she was reluctant. What she actually built, over decades, was one of the most sophisticated personal brands in British public life. After George VI died in 1952, she didn't retreat. She negotiated for herself the unprecedented title Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, a title no previous queen consort had ever held, one specifically designed to keep her at the center of the royal nomenclature, rather than fading into dowager irrelevance. She maintained Clarence House as her London residence and the Castle of May in Caithness as her Scottish retreat. She kept an enormous household, over 50 staff at Clarence House alone. She ran a packed public schedule well into her 90s. She wielded a level of influence within the royal family that far exceeded anything the reluctant framing would predict. When decisions were made about the family's public image, about how to handle crises, about who was in and who was out, the Queen Mother's voice carried weight that no one dared ignore. That wasn't a woman who had power thrust upon her. That was a woman who knew exactly what power looked like, how to acquire it, and how to keep it. Her lifestyle told its own story, and the numbers were staggering. The drinking was an open secret within the establishment. Gin and Dubonnet before lunch, wine with meals, further drinks in the evening. Not a whisper, a shrug. Everyone knew, no one said. The spending was even more striking. An overdraft of roughly £4 million at Coutts Bank, the most discreet financial institution in Britain, an overdraft that her daughter, the Queen, reportedly settled. Over 50 domestic staff at Clarence House, at taxpayer expense. A racing stable of National Hunt steeplechasers that she maintained for decades, because the Queen Mother didn't bet on other people's horses. She owned them. Her most famous runner, Devonlock, was leading the 1956 Grand National by a comfortable margin when it inexplicably collapsed on the flat, just yards from the finish. The entire nation groaned. The Queen Mother, by every account, took the disaster with perfect composure. "That's racing," she reportedly said. Easy to be philosophical about losing when you can afford to keep losing. She spent lavishly on entertaining at Clarence House, at Royal Lodge, at the Castle of May. Legendary lunches and dinners where the champagne flowed and the guest lists read like a social register of the British establishment. The civil list funded her public duties, but her private expenditure outstripped anything the civil list was designed to cover, and the gap between the two was a subject of quiet, chronic tension with the Treasury and, reportedly, with her own daughter. But who was going to challenge her? She was the Queen Mother. She was a national treasure, and by the time the financial details might have provoked serious public scrutiny, The journalists and politicians who understood the full scale of her spending were, you can guess, dead. Her political views were deeply conservative, and not in the mild, expected way. She was reportedly hostile to social change, skeptical of the Commonwealth's multiracial evolution, capable of expressing views on race that would have been devastating if anyone had recorded them. But those views were spoken in private rooms, to private audiences, and the people who heard them are gone. The closest the public ever got to a glimpse was footage published in 2015 showing the young Princess Elizabeth, about 7 years old, apparently being coached by her mother in what looked very much like a Nazi salute on the grounds of Balmoral in 1933. The palace called it an innocent childhood moment. By 2015, there was no one alive who could provide context or contradiction. Her relationship with Diana? Mythologized as warm and grandmotherly. The reality, according to those who observed both women during the 1980s and early 1990s, was more complicated and considerably colder. But Diana's letters to the Queen Mother, the letters that might have revealed the truth of what passed between them, were in those 30 sacks Margaret burned. Whatever Diana wrote, whatever was written back, it's gone. The kindly grandmother with the steady hand is the only version that remains. And then there's the authorized biography, the capstone of the whole structure. William Shawcross was granted access to write the Queen Mother's official life story. It was published in 2009, 7 years after her death. He worked with material from the Royal Archives under conditions that have never been fully disclosed. How much could he see? What was withheld? Who decided? The book runs to over 1,000 pages, and it was received politely by some reviewers and criticized sharply by others as sanitized, as hagiography dressed in scholarly clothing. The fundamental problem wasn't what Shawcross wrote. It was the architecture of the project itself. An authorized biographer, working with curated archives, producing a narrative that the subject had, in effect, pre-approved the framework for before she died. The result reads less like history and more like estate planning. A document designed not to reveal a life, but to seal the official version of it shut. Hugo Vickers and other unauthorized biographers attempted their own accounts, but they faced the same structural problem everyone faced. The primary sources were dead, the letters were burned, and the archives were locked. You can write a biography without those things, but you can't write an honest one. So here's the question nobody asks. Not, was the Queen Mother a good person? Or, was she a bad person? Those are tabloid questions, and they miss the point entirely. The real question is structural. How do we know anything about a woman who lived for 101 years, who outlived every independent witness to her first 7 decades, whose private correspondence was burned, whose staff never gave oral histories, whose archives are controlled by her descendants, whose nieces were declared dead while still alive in a mental institution, and whose only comprehensive biography was written under authorized conditions? The answer is, we don't. Not really. We know what she said she was, and she had a century to get the story right, and 0 living witnesses to say otherwise. This isn't unique to the Queen Mother. It's a pattern that repeats across history whenever someone lives long enough and holds enough power. The last survivor doesn't just witness history, they become it. Their version fills the vacuum that death creates, and over time, it hardens into fact. Not because it's true, because there's no one left to say it isn't. And every year, that process accelerates. More witnesses to the 20th century die. More curated versions become the only versions available. More stories harden into orthodoxy simply because the people who could have challenged them are gone. But here's what's worth sitting with. The institutional record of the Queen Mother's life was shaped by a woman who had 101 years to edit it, backed by a family with the resources to burn what they didn't want found and lock away the rest. That record is what the history books will say. But the unofficial record? The scattered stories, the family memories, the things servants told their children, the anecdotes passed down in households across Britain, that might actually be closer to something real. Your grandmother's story about meeting the Queen Mother at a garden party, your great-uncle's account of what it was like to work at Clarence House, the thing someone whispered at a family dinner 40 years ago that stuck with you, even though you didn't quite understand it at the time. Those stories might contain more historical truth than over 1,000 pages of authorized biography. But those stories are dying too, every year, one by one. The Queen Mother understood something about power that most people never grasp. You don't have to win the argument. You just have to outlast it. If this changed how you think about history, subscribe for more stories like this one.